And good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to this ASCILITE Live webinar, Making Your Conference Presentations More Accessible, featuring Sue Tucker from Darwin University and Darren Britten from Trobe University, who are also leaders of ASCILITE's Digital Equity SIG. And so we hope you will have lots of questions and some really productive discussion today. I'm David Porter, moderator for this session, and currently serving as part of the ASCILITE executive and organizing the webinar series. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sue and Darren. As I said, as we go along, please feel free to type any questions that you may have into the chat. We will also be sharing some resources there. And take it away, Darren and Sue.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much. So welcome. Darren and I are going to be kicking this off between us. So we'll be passing backwards and forwards, and we would encourage you to join in with us. As David has said, we are co-leaders along with Sarah Lambert of the Digital Equity Special Interest Group. We're members of that particular SIG, not because we believe we are experts in digital equity, but because it's something that we are passionate about, and we are keen to share what we do know, but also very open to learning from others as well. So please jump into the chat if you've got comments to make on anything that we say today, or if you've got questions, feel free to pass those along. David will be monitoring those, and we'll respond to them as we go through the morning.
Indeed, that's true. Thank you, Sue. That being said, as we're not experts, and so we're hoping to glean some ideas from people today as well. The presentation today will not be an exhaustive presentation. I firmly, and I don't think most people believe there's anything that can be 100% accessible, but what you can do is remove potential barriers out of the way. So we all learn little bits, and I like to phrase things. We can all improve our inclusive footprint, much like our carbon footprint. So we can learn to do a couple of new things, and we're hoping people will be able to walk away today with maybe one or two things that's piqued their curiosity, or some new way that they may think of presenting. And we will hopefully walk away with a couple of things as well from the attendees today.
So we'd like to start off by making some acknowledgements. I'll just give you a couple of moments to read that slide for yourself. So we've put some images there of where Darren and I are joining from. Mine is the top image, so I'm joining you today from Mbantua, the traditional name for Alice Springs in Central Australia, and you're looking there at an image of the West Macdonnell Ranges, which is on Aranda country.
And the bottom image, which is of a lovely spot on the Trobe Melbourne campus, which is part of our wildlife reserve, which is on part of the Wurundjeri people's land. It's there, which is part of the Kulin Nation in Victoria. So in the spirit of recognition, and for those that may not be able to read the slide today, the ASCILITE Digital Equity SIG acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and to any First Nation peoples joining us from around the world today.
And if you'd like to, we'd love to see where you are joining us from. So if you know the traditional lands that you're on today, feel free to pop that into the chat as we continue with the session. We really do want you to participate today. I suspect most of us here are familiar with Collaborate, but just in case you're not, down in your bottom right hand corner you will have a little purple icon. If you click on that, it will open up the chat panel and you can chat to us there. and you've also got a series of symbols at the bottom center of your screen, and you can use those emoticons there to let us know how you're feeling as we go through.
Just before we get into the presentation, I'll just describe some of the things we'll be doing. Any images that will be containing relevant information in our presentation, we will be verbally describing. If it's just there purely as decorative means, we won't be talking about or providing any alternate text. Where possible, we've tried to use a consistent font size throughout the presentation, but this may vary depending on people's devices that they're viewing this presentation on. We will be referencing some keyboard shortcuts and some various applications, largely based on the platform currently using, etc., on PC applications and platforms, but there will be similar options available for those that are on Apple devices. A glossary of abbreviation terms might be referenced at the end of this one. We're going to leave that. It isn't. We've got some references at the end because we took out big key fancy words because, again, we're trying to simplify and make this more inclusive. There will be a copy of this presentation made available after this session on the Digital Equity website within the next few hours. This presentation will hopefully run for the 40-50 minutes. We're hoping for some lively discussion as part of this. And so we've allowed for those questions to be built into this time. We wanted to touch on this about what is, digital equity. How do you make things more inclusive, more accessible, swapping terms in and out? So we want to focus on three kind of main areas with the presentation. One is the preparation of a presentation. The second is, then actually creating that, and then the delivery. As much as we'd all like to think we have unlimited time to prepare, create, and deliver and rehearse, we don't. And much like our session today, it comes together at the last minute, as these things do. So we're acknowledging that up front. So please, if I talk too quickly or we don't explain something clearly, please raise your hand or put the question in chat, and we will try and address that as soon as we can. Did you want to
keep going, Darren?
Okay,
no, that's yours as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So, in terms of preparation, and where some of these things I've heard described again as some of these are 101 aspects, but it's worth mentioning it's not necessarily the case all the time, again, because of that lack of time, or you put it into a last minute to change a presentation or whatever that might be, you're added onto the list for a presentation, or the requirements for conference change. So I think it's important just to stop and have a think about your presentation in terms of what do you actually want to say? What are you trying to communicate? And what would be the best way of doing that presentation? You might be limited by the conference, by the platform, by how they're doing it. Will there be multiple speakers? Will it be single speakers? If you've got two speakers, you might be able to change it from being a presentation into an interview style, where it's just a bit of Q&A back and forwards, but still cover the same amount of material. It doesn't need to be, as we're kind of presenting today, slides with talking heads and voices floating away in the background over what we're doing. Think about who your intended audience actually is. What's the level of terminology and acronyms that you'll be using, if any? Is there any prior or assumed knowledge that you're expecting people to come with to the presentation? And would there be any other additional resources you want to make available to people, and should they be available online, etc.? Have you checked your links? All of those things. And what do you want your audience to leave with? What's the key takeaway message from your presentation? You're not just doing that it's out there in the ether and you've had your say. You're hoping you want people to walk away with maybe one thing or a couple of things, or many, many things, and get completely enthralled by your presentation and want to follow up. So can they contact you afterwards? Or if you do put your email up and people want to contact you, will you be answering them, etc.? Don't ask for something you're not prepared to deliver on. And also, where can they go for more information after your presentation's finished? So I'll throw to Sue.
And I'll put my mic back on. So in terms of preparing your presentation, one of the key things in making a presentation more accessible is that we want to keep it simple. It doesn't need to be fancy. It doesn't need to have bells and whistles. A key thing is to try and use a consistent font throughout. And the recommendations are to use a sans serif font. I don't know if I say that right, when possible, or at least to avoid the more complex fonts. So the reason for using a sans serif is that it actually takes up less space, and so there's more space between the letters if you haven't got those little tails on every single letter. They're clearer to read, so much easier for people to follow. If you know you are dealing with an entire group that have challenges in reading, or if you know you've got a whole group of people who are dyslexic, there is a dyslexia font, but that can be harder to read for people who don't need it. So a simple sans serif, I think we've used Calibri, I think, in this presentation. Minimise the use of transitions and overlays is another very important thing. When you've got things that are whizzing in and out, it can get very complicated for people and hard to follow. Also, if you're using Blackboard Collaborate as your presentation tool, all of those transitions and overlays, they get stripped when you upload something into Collaborate. So you can very easily find that you've spent hours and hours on making a presentation look very fancy, only to come into Collaborate and find that it all doesn't work. And in fact, things have been compressed, so your slide format actually looks very different to what you had in mind. As we know, software is continually being updated, and one of the more recent features in PowerPoint is, you can see on the right-hand side of this slide, the column Design Ideas. And you actually don't have to use all the transition and animations and design features that are built within PowerPoint, because PowerPoint will now give you, on the right-hand side, a whole host of design ideas. And you can see there that these are some of the options that PowerPoint has suggested. What we did in designing this particular presentation is just started with a completely blank template with no design features at all, put in the words and the images, and then went to the design features and selected which were going to be appropriate for the particular slide. As far as possible, we've kept it the same throughout, but there are times where you might need to have a slightly different design for a particular slide because of the content of that slide. But that's a nice newish feature in PowerPoint.
Just with that, Sue, sorry, I'll just backtrack slightly. I did jump ahead. Apologies. The design aspects that the PowerPoint now puts in, it's actually quite smart in the background. I'm no huge advocate of Microsoft, but they've done certainly some big improvements with PowerPoint. So whilst we've just got some plain text that we've put in and some bullet points, you can see that it can vastly go and change that and arrange them with relevant icons that match keywords. So it can do a whole lot of that heavy lifting for you, and it also means the content is still accessible. So while there's a largely visual layer now being added over the top, it's still based on just more or less text that's in the background. So it does a lot of that heavy lifting for you and takes care of some of the accessibility at the same time, which is a win-win.
And I'll just add there, thanks very much, David. David's monitoring our chat for us, and he's also popped in a link there about using how to choose your fonts. So you might want to check that one out as well. Back to you, Darren.
One of my favorite topics when it comes to presentations, and as we've all been aware, we're all becoming a little bit more, we're gathering a little bit more mastery, should I say, or maybe not so much novices given what COVID has thrown us all into. But there's a few key things which have become evident, and you'll be aware of some of these that have happened over the last year with pushing everybody online. And some of those is be very cautious of your own privacy and that of others. You might be sharing other people's information as well as your own. And there's a couple of quick things you can do on a Windows machine to assist with that. One of those would be to turn off the Focus Assistant. Like in the last couple of versions of Windows, the little chat bubble up the right-hand corner, as you can see on the diagram at the right, which pops up messages. It'll pop up if you've got new emails. It'll pop up if your system's doing updates. It pops up with a whole range of things, which can be very distracting during a presentation, unless you want people to know that you have to put milk up on the way home, or that you got so many likes on your last Facebook post, etc. So you can easily just go in and turn that off while you're doing presentations, so none of those things pop up. Which also goes for closing down any unnecessary applications. So not having your Outlook or your emails open in the background. Nobody wants to see that you've just you've been approved for a grant, or maybe you do want people to see that, or that you've been denied, or anything else that might pop up from your email. And particularly while you're going and swapping screens between what you're sharing, which leads in with hiding your desktop icons. This can be, we see them all the time on our own computers, and we forget what we've actually got on our desktop. If you're like me, everything stays on your desktop and then gets filed into a folder later on. It's just the storage spot. It's where everything goes. My file management may not be 100%, but I don't think I'm alone in that basket either. So there's a very simple way on Windows to do that, and you just right click on a blank part of your screen. If it's blank and not covered in icons, you can still find a little room somewhere. Right click, select the view option, as you can see there, and go to show desktop icons. So rather than have to move things over to a folder or hide things so that people can't read the titles of files, etc. that you've got, you can just show or hide them. So I've hidden all mine during this presentation, and then I'll just go back and turn them back on afterwards. It's a lovely little feature that Microsoft hasn't really told anybody too much about. That's been in there for, I think, since the Windows 10 upgrades, and it's a very nice function. Another thing to be conscious of when doing presentations is, especially if you're crossing over and using a web browser, which a lot of people will be doing to maybe take polls, or if outside the tool, or to show other resources, websites and links, etc., is to run it in full screen. Generally that's F11, and I think it's the same even, or option 11 with the Mac, but I think all browsers F11 have it as the default key to press, which will get rid of or will give you at least an extra 20% real estate, because it will hide your address bar, it will hide your bookmarks if you haven't done that yourself, and it will hide all the other tabs that you might have open. That's another thing to be conscious of. I've been to a few webinars where you can read people's email addresses. You can see what other tabs they've got open in the background. You can see what else they're buying. You can see what their favorite football club is. There's a whole range of things you can determine just from seeing what's on somebody's screen. And again, because things are largely get recorded, or anybody can do a screenshot, even though you may only have it on screen for a second between transitions to something, that doesn't mean it can't be paused, or that frame can be data mined later on by the bigger search engines, etc. And suddenly your details and things you may not want out there known to the world. So the great advantage of this, for an inclusive aspect of it, one, it helps you, but it also reduces cognitive load by not having all this extraneous information available on screen at the same time. So there's a couple of little hints. I hope you can take some of those away if you were unaware of those aspects. Your environment is an important one, and I'll throw to Sue for a case in point.
Yes. Just before we start talking about the images that you can see in front of you, we might just pause. Does anybody have any questions up to this point? I can see David's been popping some stuff in the chat there and talking about some experiences. Anybody else have any questions or comments?
Anyone have questions for Sue or Darren? Just a comment from Amelia that says the F11 is super helpful.
Actually, Darren, I'll ask a question. If you do F11 again, does that undo it?
Yes,
right.
It'll undo it, or you can hit escape.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, it's one of those, we used to do all of these things, and somewhere, again, the busyness and computers constantly changing, and we let the tool do some of these. And so it just makes everything bigger the other end as well, because you've got less real estate, which is actually then being projected to people. So it certainly helps. We've even told people just doing presentations in lectures to do that especially even if they're just showing the LMS, or hiding the navigation bars, or hiding the side menus, which for most of them you can turn them on and off. It just, again, less cognitive load and gives you more real estate, and makes things a little bit simpler for people looking at them.
Yes. So Darren has mainly been talking about your online environment, your digital space, your screens. What I'm going to speak about for a few minutes is your physical environment. And this links very much to whether or not you are actually going to use video, and whether you expect your participants, be they students or be they webinar participants, as to whether you expect them to use video or not. So the two images that you can see are a little bit of a setup. A few months ago with a colleague, I was running a webinar on how to run webinars for our staff at CDU. And so the first photo, the top one, is a bit of a setup of some what not to do things. And you might like to pop in the chat if you'd like, if you can see some things in that image that are not a particularly good environment from which to be presenting. So or turn your mic on if you'd like to speak, if you can see some things in that image that you think shouldn't be there. Cool, yes. We've got a whiteboard with a whole lot of information. We've got some phone numbers, yes. A very, very busy pattern on the jumper. We've got an iPad. So there's lots of things there. And this is a setup. The phone numbers are fake. So the other thing that I actually wasn't aware of until I saw the photo, this was taken midwinter, so I'm wearing all my jumpers, and I look like just a disembodied head. My dark jumper disappears into the dark background. Then we've got all the private information. So something, and there's a fan there, and there's all sorts of things. It's very, very messy. It's very distracting. It is a tiara, yes, Amelia. Our team was working from home at that point, and we were having Friday drinks. So each Friday we did dress up, and yes, my tiara was there. So very messy. What can we do about it? A few of you in chat are putting up, we can use virtual backgrounds, and yes, we can. I don't know if any of you are actually watching me on video at the moment, but I tend to talk with my hands. And one of the things that happens with virtual backgrounds is that if I wave my hands out here, they tend to disappear. The virtual backgrounds aren't perfect. So they're a possibility. The other possibility in my case was simply a quick little tidy up. And you can see that in the bottom photo, I've changed my clothes so you can actually see me, and done a tidy up, cleaned off the whiteboard, removed the whiteboard with the phone numbers, and put away the tiara and the iPad somewhere else. That literally took me 5 minutes. So a much cleaner environment, and without all of the, again, the cognitive overload of having all those distractions.
Yes,
particularly
it's
true.
Sue did a fantastic thing that I'm going to get in the habit of doing as well now, when going to present, but also when just joining some meetings, and if you're in there with somebody you know beforehand, asking, is there anything in my background that I should be aware of because I've forgotten things that I've moved around or that, but just asking, is there anything there, and can you see me? Is there enough light in the room, etc. So just a little check beforehand. Is lovely. If you're like me, you've probably noticed all of the interviews on TV because everything's been people virtual, obviously. And if you start reading everybody's bookshelves in the background and seeing what books they've got, you can tell a lot about people by their backgrounds. And it's also the virtual backgrounds. My favorite one's just putting the Game of Thrones up there, which I think quite what the current environment's like. But I digress. Sorry, Sue.
That's cool. Now, David has, thank you again, put another link into the chat for us from a blog post, which is called Cameras Optional, Please, Remembering Student Lives as We Plan Our Online Syllabus. And if you've been following on Twitter or on LinkedIn or wherever you, whatever spaces you occupy, there has been an enormous amount of discussion over the last few months about whether or not cameras should be on or off in this kind of environment, particularly from those who are teaching in schools, and both the teacher and the students are now teaching and learning from home. There's a body of people who think that cameras must be on because that's the only way you can tell if your students are engaged, and that helps for attendance and a whole host of reasons. But there's also a very strong argument for people to choose not to have their cameras on, for bandwidth, for privacy. Maybe they're at home and they're sharing a house with 3 other people. There's a whole host of reasons why people might not want to have their cameras on. So David has put that link in there, so you can take a look at that blog post. There's also another really interesting article that I came across probably a couple of months ago. So this is a research paper, 5 ways to increase the effectiveness of instructional video. And it talks through, as it says, 5 ways to use instructional video, and gives some examples of, for example, that students might find it easier to understand mathematical equations when they actually see the teacher work them out on the board, as opposed to flashing to, here's one I prepared earlier. Interestingly, at the end of the article, it finishes up with one reason not to use video in a webinar. So you've probably got sort of little talking heads in amongst the screen where you're seeing the presentation. And the findings of this particular piece of research was that having a talking head in an instructional video actually did not add any instructional benefits. And in many cases, people found that that was a distraction. So you're trying to focus on the content that's being presented to you, and then depending on your layout of your screen, maybe off to the side or down below somewhere, you've got this little talking head. And I can certainly say that I've found I'm like, do I watch the head or do I watch the slides? So that's a really interesting article to read, and to think about the cognitive load for your participants. Do they actually need to see you? And there have been times where some tools allow you to flick backwards and forwards and turn the presenter video off and focus on the content, and then flick back to the presenter when it's just a discussion that's happening. So I commend those 2 articles to you. There's plenty of others as well, if you want to go looking for those. Let me just take a minute. I can see there's some stuff happening in the chat.
Oh,
Absolutely,
it's just
Mary. Yes.
Yeah. Yes, about students with anxiety. Mary had mentioned students with anxiety say that it increases their anxiety to put the camera on. Around the microphone and having students mic'd, I had an interesting experience in a webinar one time where basically the student was participating in the session, had their mic on, and apparently parents or somebody else in the household had a very, very loud argument in the background. Now, luckily, I was able to actually control the mics and mute it on behalf of the student. But I see that sort of as another risk in these environments where even the sound and what comes through and potentially something that could be embarrassing to the student could come across.
Yeah, very definitely. You really don't have to dig very far through either Twitter or LinkedIn to find blog posts or journal articles that have been written through COVID about some of the stresses that people are under. So yeah, Darren, I think back to you.
And just with that is giving that flexibility, and you touched on it, David. We've had some instances where it's like, now we want an open discussion, so everybody has to have their mic on, and it might be somebody's in a noisy environment, they may not want it on, their child's crying, other things are happening, they're working from home with 3 other people. you've got to allow the option for some people to communicate via chat, not necessarily via the microphone. Even if you're breaking things out into group work and things like that, that everybody be respectful. People may be communicating differently given their environments, etc. Okay, so we're getting down to the delivery aspects of the presentation. It's always good to practice your presentation. I don't think I'm telling anybody anything new here. It's also good to practice with the platform you might be using. So when you get there and then suddenly discover, oh, actually, this isn't the tool I was expecting to be using, and how do I use it? And do I have a backup for it? Do I need to upload the presentation? Do I need to give it to somebody else? So when does it need to be available, etc. Obvious things, checking your microphone and video works. As Sue pointed out, start know where the tools are and the ones that you plan to use, how they work, and also provide those instructions to other people because they may not be familiar with the platform themselves. So, give people time, a little bit of time to get accustomed with the tool and how to use it, where to go to provide with some of those options. There's no such thing as a stupid question. And there's only stupid answers, and I tend to give most of those, so that's how I encourage people. As happened at the start, delivering your presentation, you want to let the audience know the session is being recorded for obvious reasons. Some people may choose to opt out, even having their video on for that very reason, etc. I know of a student because of RDOs, etc., that didn't want their video on and doesn't want their actual name presented either. So there's issues about how can you put somebody in anonymously into a group when somebody else may be tracking them, etc. Use the platform tools, etc. Chat as we're doing. Repeat any and paraphrase any questions. You may have, not everybody can necessarily read the chat, so try and rephrase the question for everybody's benefits. And if you are sharing your desktop rather than necessarily sharing a direct application, sometimes that's easier if you're not familiar with the tool. You just share your desktop and then whatever application you've got. Alt tabbing. If people have never done that before, Alt tab is your best friend. So rather than try and click through various icons to find what you're after, you can Alt tab and it will bring up every application or window that you've got open, and just keep Alt tabbing till you get to the one that you want, and then release, and that will be the screen that's now being broadcast. So that way you can skip over those things if you do have to have your email running in the background, or you have to have something else there to run that you don't want other people to see. So,
Pop my mic back on. Love that image. Thanks, Darren. So after your presentation, if it has been recorded, you obviously need to be familiar with where that recording goes. And if you're like us here at CDU, you use a variety of different tools. So we often use Collaborate, we also use Teams. You need to know where that presentation goes to, and then make sure that it is there, and then check it. You might need to do some post-production work. There might need to be some bits that need to be edited. You may need to do an intro and an outro before that can then be circulated. If you've recorded your chat, have a look through the transcript of that. You may need to edit that. There might be some privacy things. You might want to tidy up some spelling or some grammar in that, and check the content. And also check the transcript. So a lot of tools will provide an automatic transcript, but it doesn't always record exactly what you said. I think, Darren, you had an example of something that had come up in some recordings.
Yes, we've had many. It's been one of my great passions for some time is automatic speech recognition, and people may be aware certainly of the Google translations that happened when YouTube videos started getting automatically captioned several years ago. But we've had some situations where there's been some promotional material go out, and words have been misinterpreted to the wrong things, and you end up, some of this may seem, some things end up quite funny. I mean, the Trobe often comes up as Trump University for some reason, and so there's reasons we don't want to be associated with those things. But there's also been situations where the word, rape, etc., is associated with some academics. It's not what they said at all, but it's now tied to their name in a search engine somewhere. One thing YouTube and Google have actually said in terms of search engine rankings. If your video has a transcript, and it's a human transcript, not a automatic one, it will rank higher than other videos, just purely because there's more information that can be found about that video. So flip side of it is, if you've got a transcript there and it's not accurate, they're the words that are now being associated. We know anything goes online stays online. And at some point, you don't want to be typing your name in for a presentation you've done and there's words there that you did not say that are now getting associated into your online profile, etc. If you haven't watched the new social media doco, I'd encourage everybody to go and do that. But enough said about that. Yes, there's some really funny words in some translations that happen, but there is a serious side to it as well. And also, if you've asked a guest person to come and present, it's very critical. If you've got a visiting professor, visiting dignitary that you brought in to say a few words, and that's being recorded and streamed, I'm sure they will make sure that what they said is actually accurate, not being misinterpreted for the same reason. So you need to check that on behalf of other people that you've invited.
Yeah, certainly. And the final thing, of course, is to think then about your circulation. Where is the recording going? Is it only going to those who attended, or is it going to be put out there as, for example, the ASCILITE Live webinars? Is it going to be on a YouTube channel? And then if it's public, then obviously you want to promote it. So think about your social channels, promote it through those. You might want to put links on Twitter. You might want to put links on your LinkedIn account. Obviously, depending what it is, target your particular groups as to who might benefit from that particular recording. You may also need to think about any copyright. So where did you give your presentation? If it was at a conference, was it an open or a closed conference? And do you actually have permission to circulate it in a public environment? So lots of things to think about after your presentation as well.
Yeah, and some context with that as well. Never goes astray. People think, I know what this recording was, I know why it was there, and I've just put this up there, but now it's out of context. It was actually part of a larger discussion. It was part of something. So giving people some context that maybe watching it later makes sense. Just along with the privacy as well, because I just thought of this. It's just come up because I'm reading the chat as well, only because I've seen it before. People have actually copied, and some of the tools you can then copy the chat that's there, and people will paste that up saying, look, here was the lively discussion. But that chat has people's names in it. In some cases, some people use first names, some people might put a pseudonym in, but in some cases, people use their real names. Be cautious of what other information you're posting out there without other people's permission as well.
So we've got some references in this. I think all of these have now been posted into the chat. Thank you, David. So do follow those up. There's some interesting things there. The bottom two there are articles that are already on the ASCILITE SIG website. So go there and have a look. And if you want to catch up with us, there we are. Digital Equity at ask.ascilite.org. and DigEcSig on Twitter. We'd love to have you join us and chat with us. I'm on Twitter personally as well at, I'll pop it in the chat actually, Sue in Asp. People often ask why Sue in Asp. ASP is the official airport abbreviation for Alice Springs. So I'm stuck. I can never move. That's my Twitter handle.
Be careful. You can get locked in. And I'm not on any of the social media channels. I'm a programmer from way, way back, so I've avoided a whole bunch of these things for good and for bad, etc. Thank you, Nicole. Nicole's just posted she has to run. Thank you.
She's gone.
Gone already.
Thank you, Darren. Yeah.
So we'll open
Oh,
this up
sorry.
for questions now. We've left some room there. I know we've only lightly covered on a few of the things. Hopefully there's some bits there, but if anybody else has some tips that they'd like to share, we'd be more than happy to hear about them.
Thank you, Darren and Sue. That was fantastic, and some really practical information that we can all action. So does anybody have questions for Sue and Darren, or other points they want to raise? There's been some very lively discussion in the chat, and that's much appreciated. So we'll open it up now. Mary, I see your mic is on. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a couple of points. I had a chat with a friend of mine who is blind, just about how to make presentations more accessible to him, or to maximise their accessibility. And he said a couple of really, the things that made a difference to him were, firstly, if the presentation was distributed to attendees beforehand, so that he could follow on with his own version using a screen reader. Often there are, there's stuff on the screen that's not read, and it allows him to have a richer content. And obviously that means that every image needs to have an audio description, so that the screen reader will pick it up. And yeah, he just emphasised the importance of really describing what's on the screen. You know how we have on the ABC now that option for audio description. So if there's a graph there, just describing actually what's on the graph, and what the pattern is, and what's in an image, if it's meaningful, and that kind of thing, really makes him to feel as if he's actually had a meaningful experience. I just thought I'd throw that in, because it's there are things that are often overlooked, and there are a reasonably large sort of proportion of people with vision impairments around at universities now.
Yes. No, there's some really good points, Mary. And similar experience certainly with the students at my area has supported at La Trobe with that. We didn't get into too much detail in this presentation with that. It could be another 3-week seminar session on all the things that we could do. But they're very practical advice. There was a couple of things we did at the start of this presentation, and that was to describe 2 things. One, what would be in the presentation, but also, the fonts that we would be using, that we would be describing images, so people are aware if there has been an image that is relevant. But you're right, having some of these things available in advance can be a huge bonus to participation for some students, particularly blind students using various types of assistive technology.
Amelia has her hand up. Amelia, you want to ask a question?
Hello. I was just going to make a comment too about some of the things that can be helpful for people participating. We've got, I've had quite a bit of feedback from students who are sort of neurodiverse in all sorts of ways, and the notifications cause big problems for a lot of people. So we've started really purposefully, like spending a bit of time at the beginning of all of our webinars talking to people about how they can turn off the notifications, because it really, for some people, stops them from being involved at all. Just the sounds are too distracting, and then they get overwhelmed with the navigation, because the sounds are still coming and keeping on going, and that's made a big difference for us. The notifications and talking about that. Also, thank you for all the really great helpful information.
Thanks, Amelia. That's a really helpful tip, and it's I think it's really important for us, all of us as presenters, to be across the different platforms that we work with, and an awareness of the different features of each platform. So, for example, in some platforms, I think in Zoom, you can change your name, whereas in Collaborate, I was looking earlier, and I don't think you can. So you can have that privacy in some, which isn't available in others. Just the getting across the different features and knowing what you can do, and that might even impact on the choice of which platform you use for a particular presentation.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and I had forgotten about that as well. We had to write up guides early in the year, obviously with students going to COVID again, about turning off notifications for exactly that reason. Because some of these tools, there's every time somebody puts something in chat, every time somebody leaves, every time somebody does anything, a slide changes, up comes a noise, a notification, or it will announce it to them because of their screen reader. So having some of those things available beforehand to some students to empower them, we've had. But I think that might actually be a good thing to even mention for the conference, depending on the platform that's there, to actually just have a couple of guides available beforehand for people that might be joining and haven't used the platform that's there, letting them know what those options are beforehand. So again, they can prepare, or at least having a space for people to jump into and have a play before the presentations actually happen. An empty session that they can jump in and prepare themselves for using the tool before the session starts. But that's a really good point.
Do we have any other further questions, comments, other things that folks want to share? Well, seeing none, thank you, Sue and Darren, again for this fantastic presentation, and I think we should share this widely across our networks, because I think there's a lot to be taken from it. So it's fantastic. I want to thank everybody for attending today. Before everyone rushes off, we do want to remind folks that the ASCILITE conference is actually only just a couple of weeks away. And you will find the link for the conference website down there in the chat. Check it out if you haven't yet registered. Now is still an opportunity to do so. And if you're one of the presenters at that conference, hopefully you'll be able to take some of these tips forward for that. Our next ASCILITE Live webinar will be taking place the 15th of December. And that is featuring the editors of AJET Special Issue, looking at scalable online learning and partnerships and the unbundling of the university. So please watch the ASCILITE website for that. Again, we thank you for joining us for the ASCILITE Live webinar, and we hope to see you at the conference or in one of our future webinars. Thank you, everybody, and have a great